General Hospital spoilers reveal that the baptism of Daisy was intended to be a quiet celebration of new beginnings. A gentle ceremony that would bring closure to the turbulent past and offer hope for the future. For Sasha, it was supposed to be a day where joy triumphed over sorrow. Where her daughter would be welcomed into the world with love and purity, and where her own fragile healing would be affirmed by the presence of those who claimed to care for her. But what transpired within the walls of that church was nothing short of a psychological ambush, an event that quickly spiraled out of control and became a harrowing symbol of how far the darkness in Port Charles had spread. What should have been holy was instead desecrated by secrets, hidden agendas, and the invisible hand of manipulation that turned Daisy's baptism into a living nightmare. From the moment the first candle was lit, an unshakable tension settled over the pews like a heavy mist. Sasha could feel it in her bones, the subtle glances exchanged between Sonny and Michael. The tight smiles from Carly, the sudden absence of Willow, and the strange way some guests kept looking toward the rear of the church as if expecting a confrontation. Daisy, dressed in white lace and cradled against Sasha's trembling chest, was completely unaware of the sinister undertones infecting her moment of grace. As the minister began to speak, Sasha's mind raced, not just from nerves but from the growing sense that something was wrong. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. The air shifted dramatically when an uninvited figure appeared in the back of the church. Eyes turned, whispers rose, and what followed was not a scene of unity and blessing, but one of gasps, raised voices, and a slow unraveling of peace. Though the identity of the figure remains unclear. Their appearance seemed calculated, a disruption designed to fracture what little was left of Sasha's world. What happened next is still shrouded in confusion. But reports say that Daisy's baptism was cut short amid escalating tensions between factions in the crowd, culminating in a volatile scene that forced Sasha to flee the altar in tears. The emotional damage was immediate. Sasha, already haunted by the deaths of loved ones and the betrayals that have plagued her relationships, found herself once again cast into the role of victim, scapegoat, and abandoned soul. She returned home not with a sense of completion, but with the crushing weight of guilt and humiliation. But this time, something inside her changed. The girl who once retreated into silence and mental collapse now felt a dangerous clarity. She would not survive another collapse. She could not depend on the people who had failed her repeatedly. This time, she needed allies who understood war, not prayer. This time, she needed Holly Sutton and Robert Scorpio. Her message to them was brief but desperate. She told them everything, how the baptism had been ruined, how her daughter was no longer safe, how Michael's obsession with power had consumed him, and how Sonny's silence had enabled it. She confessed her belief that the entire event had been orchestrated to humiliate her, to strip her of her maternal dignity, and perhaps even to send her back into psychiatric care. She feared that Daisy would be taken away from her, not by the courts, but by manipulation, coercion, and untraceable threats. Holly and Robert, once protectors of the vulnerable and investigators of international conspiracies, were now the only names that made sense to her. As Sasha waited for their arrival, she began piecing together a theory, one that sounded paranoid but felt chillingly plausible. She suspected that someone within the Corinthos circle had deliberately sabotaged the baptism to push her over the edge. She even considered the possibility that Sidwell, still operating in the shadows with a vendetta against Sonny, had been behind the disruption, using Daisy's ceremony as a message of intent. Perhaps this was a declaration of war. And Daisy's innocence was now a bargaining chip in a much larger battle. While others in Port Charles gossiped about the scene in the church, Sasha prepared for the worst. She began documenting every strange encounter, every misplaced look, every person who had tried to talk her out of holding the ceremony. And with every note she took, she felt less like a broken mother and more like a woman gathering evidence. The transformation was subtle but irreversible. Sasha was no longer a passive figure in her own downfall. She was preparing to fight back. When Holly and Robert finally responded to her call, they came not as relics of the past but as two warriors stepping back into the battlefield. They listened to Sasha's fears without judgment, taking her suspicions seriously, and quietly began their own investigation. Robert focused on tracing the security footage from the church, while Holly started probing into the guest list and identifying anyone who might have had ties to Sidwell or Drew. What they found shocked even them. There were too many coincidences. Too many unexplained absences. Too many people who suddenly had reasons to turn against Sasha. Together, the trio formed a quiet alliance, unofficial, off the books, but deadly serious. Sasha no longer walked alone. And as rumors began to swirl that the baptism incident might have been just the first of several targeted disruptions, Holly and Robert became convinced that Port Charles was facing a new kind of war. A psychological war. One where children were pawns, love was weaponized, and faith was corrupted for political gain. Sasha's suffering had become the front line of a much larger battle, and Daisy, her precious, innocent daughter, was no longer just a baby. She was a symbol. A target. A prophecy of what would come if the cycle of control and betrayal continued. And as the sun set on Port Charles, casting long shadows over the remnants of the broken ceremony, one truth became clear. The baptism was never about faith. It was about power. And Sasha, once crushed by grief, now stood at the center of the storm with allies at her back and fire in her heart. She would not let Daisy be consumed by the same darkness that nearly destroyed her. And she would burn down everything, reputation, alliance, legacy, before she let that happen. The mounting pressure in Port Charles was no longer a ripple but a tidal wave crashing over everyone caught in its path. A new and volatile shift had begun to take root. A recalibration of power that was as invisible as it was deadly. It wasn't just a change in alliances or a subtle rewriting of loyalty, it was a structural upheaval. A silent but sweeping adjustment that no one could fully define but everyone could feel. The city's familiar players were being forced to adapt under a suffocating pressure that twisted even the most logical minds into paranoia. And at the center of this chaos, Sonny and Holly found themselves standing on unstable ground, caught between what they knew and what they feared. This wasn't just another skirmish, it was an unraveling. A psychological implosion. And it had all the markings of something far darker than anyone could have predicted. Sonny, long a figure of power, had spent years navigating the treacherous lines between family and territory. Love and violence. But even he was beginning to sense that something about this moment felt different. The rules were shifting. The enemies weren't declaring war, they were infiltrating the very fabric of relationships and institutions, playing a long game built on secrets and half-truths. And with each passing day, Sonny felt less in control and more like a man being hunted by ghosts he couldn't name. That was when he turned to Holly. Holly Sutton had always been a woman of dualities, elegant but lethal. Charming yet calculating. Her return to Port Charles had been quiet, unnoticed by most, but not by Sonny. He knew that if anyone could see through a smokescreen and identify the real threat, it would be her. What he didn't expect was how much she already knew. From the moment they sat down in the shadows of Sonny's back office, Holly had the look of someone who had been watching long before the game officially began. What Holly revealed wasn't just speculation, it was a devastating pattern of coordination. Of targeted psychological warfare being deployed against key figures in Port Charles. She suspected Drew wasn't just manipulating Willow, but was working as a cog in a much larger machine, one that had ties to corporate espionage, judicial leverage, and even past WSB factions that had gone rogue. It was all too elaborate to be mere coincidence. And the deeper they went, the more Sonny began to question whether anyone close to him was truly safe. The most disturbing revelation, however, came when Holly admitted that she had purposely remained in the background, not just observing but documenting everything. She had infiltrated digital networks, gained access to redacted files, and even watched Daisy's baptism unfold from a vantage point that revealed things no camera could. She had seen the nervous glances, the delayed reactions, and the small, orchestrated disruptions that turned what should have been a peaceful moment into a psychological ambush. Holly had stood in the darkness and witnessed what no one else could. The coordinated unraveling of Sasha's world and the deliberate activation of trauma in public view. And now, She was beginning to believe that Sasha wasn't the only target, she was simply the first domino. This changed everything for Sonny. He realized that his role as a protector was no longer just about muscle or influence, it was about perception, timing, and choosing whom to trust when everything around him was a potential illusion. The very idea that someone had used a child's baptism to trigger mental collapse sent a cold fury through him. This was no longer about territory. It was psychological terrorism disguised as tragedy. And Sonny knew that if he didn't respond, he wouldn't just lose control, he'd lose the city. Holly, for her part, knew that time was running out. The enemy was watching, waiting, and growing bolder with each successful manipulation. She didn't just want to stop them, she wanted to expose them. But that meant playing a dangerous game. One where she would have to use herself as bait and put Sonny in a position where trust could no longer be given freely. Together, they began crafting a response, not just a counterstrike but a campaign of their own. If someone had turned grief into a weapon, Holly and Sonny would turn exposure into justice. But as they moved forward, they couldn't ignore the creeping dread that this battle would come with casualties. Already, Willow was being dragged deeper into a relationship with Drew that seemed to mimic captivity more than love. Sasha's mental stability was hanging by a thread. Jason was being pulled into a hunt for Britt that felt more like a rescue from a hellish laboratory than a reunion. And Michael, once the steady sun, was shifting into something colder. More calculating, perhaps even complicit. It was clear that what was happening in Port Charles was no longer just a series of bad choices. It was a design. An intricate, malicious architecture meant to collapse everything familiar and reshape it into something unrecognizable. And Holly, standing in the shadows all this time, had finally stepped into the light, not to warn them, but to fight beside them. There was no turning back. The adjustment wasn't temporary. The madness wasn't passing. The obsession wasn't isolated. Everything had changed. And as Sonny and Holly stood at the edge of this unraveling, they both understood something they could never say out loud. This wasn't just a war for power, it was a war for identity. For reality. For control over how people saw the world and themselves. And the ones who had weaponized perception now had their sights set on Daisy, Sasha, Willow, and everyone they loved. Port Charles had been adjusted. The question was, could it ever be restored? The situation surrounding Daisy's baptism had already pushed the emotional boundaries of Port Charles to their breaking point, but with Holly stepping into the frame, it was clear that the chaos had only just begun to unfold. What was meant to be a symbolic celebration of innocence and renewal had devolved into a psychological minefield, tearing open old wounds and exposing carefully buried truths. And now, as Holly prepared to intervene and rescue Daisy from the encroaching darkness that had surrounded her, it became evident that this was not just an act of compassion, it was a strategic strike in a much larger war. Holly's movements were not driven solely by sentiment, they were calculated, purposeful, and born from the belief that saving Daisy was not only a moral imperative but also a way to preserve a legacy she could no longer allow to be erased. Holly had seen too much to pretend any longer. As she watched the walls close in around Sasha, Willow, and the people they cared about, she understood that this wasn't a series of isolated incidents, it was a coordinated effort to dismantle everything that gave the Quartermaines, the Cassidines, and the Scorpio families their strength. Daisy, as young and unassuming as she might be, had become a symbol, an unintended but powerful emblem of hope, of resistance, and of truth. And the attack on her, whether psychological or physical, was designed to send a message: no one, not even a child, was beyond reach. But Holly refused to accept that. Not on her watch. Not with Daisy's life hanging in the balance. And so she stepped out of the shadows and began the process of dismantling the trap that had been set. What made this rescue so much more volatile, however, was that Holly wasn't acting on her own. She had begun to coordinate with Jason and Sonny, forming an unlikely triad of strategy, grit, and vengeance. While Jason worked to uncover the deeper network responsible for Britt's disappearance and Sonny hunted the corrupt figures infiltrating Port Charles's justice system, Holly had chosen a different front. Her battlefield was the mind. The soul. The emotional core of the town that had once been her home and was now being transformed into something unrecognizable. And she knew that if she couldn't extract Daisy from the epicenter of this growing darkness, then everything else would fall apart, piece by piece, life by life. What no one had expected, however, was just how personal this mission would become for Holly. In trying to save Daisy, she found herself confronting the unresolved traumas of her own past, the children she'd lost. The battles she'd fought in silence, the compromises she'd made in the name of survival. Every time she looked into Daisy's frightened eyes, she saw a mirror to a younger version of herself. One who had also once been hunted, betrayed, and nearly destroyed. That emotional connection became both a strength and a liability. It made Holly fearless. But it also made her reckless. And as the forces aligned against them began to tighten their grip, Holly realized she might have to sacrifice more than just her anonymity to see this mission through. She might have to sacrifice herself. The rescue operation became a race against time. With Drew's manipulation spreading like a virus through Willow's life and Michael and Sasha becoming pawns in a political and emotional game they barely understood. Holly saw that saving Daisy would not end the madness, it would only delay it. But sometimes, delaying the collapse was all you could do. Sometimes, creating just one small fracture in the enemy's plan could open the door to hope. And that was the mission she had accepted. She would be the fracture. She would be the chaos inside the chaos. The unexpected variable that they hadn't accounted for. What made her even more dangerous was her ability to anticipate the enemy's next move. She knew this wasn't just about Daisy, it was about legacy. About the past trying to erase the future. And in that battle, Holly had no intention of backing down. She was fighting not just for Daisy's life, but for every child, every family, every thread of memory that gave Port Charles its heart. She was fighting for the right to grieve, to heal. To love without fear of being turned into a pawn. And no matter how many traps were laid before her, she refused to let the darkness win. The deeper she went, the more she uncovered, a network of surveillance cloaked in digital silence, old enemies hiding behind new faces, and plans to reprogram not just individuals, but the entire narrative of the town. Everything was being rewritten. Everything was being manipulated. But Holly had always known how to rewrite the story. And this time, she would write it in blood if she had to. Daisy would live. And the truth, no matter how long it took, would rise. Because some legacies are too sacred to destroy, and some women, like Holly, are too dangerous to defeat. The battle lines in Port Charles were no longer blurred, they were sharpened, drawn deep into the concrete beneath the city, and drenched in the history, ambition, and trauma of the families who had long fought to control it. Sidwell, once a whisper in the halls of power, now stood boldly as an architect of chaos. A man who had waited in the shadows long enough and was now unleashing a strategy so intricate, so merciless, that even Sonny, who had faced betrayals, coups, and assassins, was struggling to keep pace. This wasn't just about territory or revenge anymore, this was about psychological domination, about dismantling every structure Sonny had built to protect the people he loved. Sidwell had studied Sonny for years, cataloging every weakness, every bond, every loyalty, and every moment of hesitation. And now, he was exploiting them all. One by one. He peeled away the layers that had long protected Sonny from the abyss, his alliances, his children, his reputation. But the most vicious strike was not aimed at Sonny's body, but at his mind. His stability, and his legacy. And this time, the pain was not abstract. It was personal. It was Sasha weeping in the church after Daisy's baptism was marred by anonymous threats and shadowy figures lurking near the pews. It was Willow clinging to her broken ideals. Lured further into Drew's madness and suddenly seeing Sonny as her last, desperate refuge. It was Jason watching his brother unravel while trying to hold together the fragments of truth that Britt's reappearance had shattered. And it was Holly. Returned not as a symbol of elegance and grace, but as a vessel for every betrayal she had swallowed, every injustice she had endured in silence. She was not the same woman who once played diplomacy like a symphony. She was a warrior now, forged in grief and sharpened by rage. And she had seen what Sidwell was capable of in ways no one else had. She knew the depth of his obsession. She understood that this was not simply a grab for influence, but an existential purge, a vision to burn the town and rebuild it in his image. And so, while Sonny prepared for battle with his familiar tools of intimidation and firepower, Holly prepared for something deeper, darker, and far more dangerous. She immersed herself in the records, the surveillance, the whispers coming from orphaned intelligence channels. She reactivated connections in WSB, called in favors that were decades old, and quietly recruited forces who owed her not allegiance, but salvation. For Holly, this was no longer just a mission, it was the preservation of a legacy, a last stand for a version of Port Charles that still held on to its soul. The baptism had been a turning point. It had been meant to mark a rebirth, a moment of peace, a communal cleansing. But it had descended into confusion, fear, and dread. The symbolism was lost as Sasha's hands trembled. As the priest's voice faltered, as uninvited figures watched from behind stained glass shadows. Daisy had become a target, not for who she was, but for what she represented, a continuation of something Sidwell sought to annihilate. And as that sacred event dissolved into anxiety, Sasha's pain deepened. She had already endured so much, loss, addiction, grief, but this was different. This was the calculated unraveling of her hope. In desperation, she reached out not to the police, not to Sonny, but to Holly. And Holly, watching from the periphery, had already seen enough to know that intervention was no longer optional, it was destiny. Sidwell had targeted the wrong child, the wrong mother, the wrong legacy. And Holly, who had buried friends and burned bridges, would not let another innocent life be devoured by the machine of madness. But she knew that to destroy Sidwell, she would have to expose herself to every danger she had once fled from. Her past with WSB had given her enemies, some of whom still held knives behind their smiles. She would have to walk through fire and deception, through memories of lives lost and missions aborted, through the rawness of knowing that even her own choices had once placed children in harm's way. And yet she did not hesitate. Because this war was no longer theoretical. It had come home. It had entered the churches, the hospitals, the courts, and the very dreams of those she cared about. And she would burn it out if she had to. Sonny, meanwhile, found himself in unfamiliar terrain. For decades, he had ruled with instinct, protected with loyalty, and navigated betrayal like a seasoned sailor through storms. But this was different. Sidwell wasn't driven by greed or vengeance, he was driven by ideology, by obsession. By the need to dismantle Sonny not only as a man but as a symbol. And so Sonny, for the first time in years, had to rethink everything. He had to step outside the fortress of his usual tactics and consider the unthinkable, alliances with former enemies, sacrifices that once would have been intolerable. And trusting people who reminded him of pain. That was how Holly became more than just an ally, she became essential. She had the insight, the flexibility, the cold detachment needed to fight someone like Sidwell. She saw patterns Sonny did not. She could predict chaos. And she was not afraid to get her hands dirty in ways Sonny no longer could without destroying himself. But trust, especially now, was a volatile currency. Jason watched their collaboration with quiet tension, haunted by the knowledge that his loyalties were split not between people, but between competing versions of the truth. He had discovered too much, about Britt, about Dalton, about Vaughn, about Emma and Jocelyn's tangled web of secrets. He knew that the coming war would not be fought in alleys or warehouses, it would be fought in laboratories, in courtrooms, in mental health facilities. And in the broken homes of those who no longer knew who they were. He understood, too, that Sonny was slipping. The grief over Michael, the betrayal from Willow. The constant surveillance of Sidwell's agents, it was eating at him like acid, and Jason feared that when the final move came, Sonny might not be the one to make it. And so Holly moved quietly. invisibly, navigating a chessboard that had outgrown its original players. She intercepted coded messages between Sidwell and operatives in foreign embassies. She unearthed documents about experimental treatments linked to Drew's psychological hold over Willow. She gathered evidence of Daisy's targeted surveillance. The subliminal messages implanted into her baptismal music, the symbolic warnings etched into the church altar that only an intelligence officer would recognize. She saw the connections, how Sidwell's plans extended beyond Port Charles, how they reached into the very institutions that once defined the town's sense of self. And she prepared. She prepared a strike, not of bullets, but of exposure, of leverage, of psychological undoing. But the cost would be high. Already, rumors were spreading, about her, about Daisy. About a resurgence of WSB control in local affairs. Already, she could feel the ground shifting beneath her. But she had made peace with that. Because if Sonny fell, if Sidwell won, if Sasha broke, and if Daisy died, then everything she had fought for would be meaningless. The legacy she carried, the oath she had sworn to protect the innocent, would crumble. So the city held its breath. Because this was no longer about rivalries or revenge, it was about survival. The survivors of this war would not be the ones who shot fastest or ran furthest, but the ones who understood what was truly at stake. And Holly, haunted, brilliant, unstoppable, understood it better than anyone. Because this wasn't just a war for control. It was a reckoning. It was a battle for the soul of Port Charles, and only one vision could remain standing when the fire cleared.